Good afternoon, and thank you to Mark for the introduction, and thank you to NAS for the invitation to join the lunchtime talks and give today's presentation. Thank you all for signing in. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project that I've been involved with since its start in September last year. And this is basically a shipwreck survey and excavation in the Baltic Sea off of the coast of Sweden, the southern coast of Sweden. I appear to have a little alarm has come up from the web platform here, so bear with me while I just get rid of it so I can move between slides. Right, there we go. Excellent. So basically the wreck is called the Gribshunden, and she went down in 1495. She was the Danish King's own personal ship of his fleet, and this area of Sweden at that time in 1495 was part of Denmark. It's now part of Sweden. Where she is she's just on the leeward side of Store Ekon Island, and this is off of a small town called Ronneby in the archipelago. She was first dived in 1970 by the Dockingarna Dive Club, and a test trench was excavated in 2006. What the club did, they had bad weather, they decided to go inside the lee of the island, do a training dive with their club members because they couldn't get out to a bigger wreck offshore. And what they found when they did this was they found timbers sticking out from the seabed. The site is very, very shallow, which makes it ideal for us from a working point of view. Maximum depth is 12 meters off the wreck site, and the minimum depth is 9 meters up on top of that. Now, she is buried underneath the sediment and mud of over 500 years of deposits from the tides, from the currents, etc. So all you see when you drop into the water, being the Baltic, often fairly limited visibility, is pieces of timber sticking out of the water. This photo here on the left is about 4 weeks into our first project, which was across the latter part of August and early part of September last year, 2019. So what you'll see here is not common when you first arrive on site. To give you an idea, in the background of that picture, you'll see a scaffold frame, kind of level with the cylinders on this diver's rebreather. And that was the seabed level when we first arrived. So this is about 4 weeks of excavation down into the site. We were permitted to dig a trench 6 meters by 2 meters during the project last year. And the permission for that enables you to continue excavating down. When I say dig, obviously you're not digging, you're removing very, very small layers, centimetre at a time, gently. You can see in the photo here using a paintbrush and a water dredge, so no artifact is missed or damaged, and so everything can be recorded in context. But here we are about 3 meters down towards the end of our month, and our limit point was sterile ground. So if we were to go down past the bottom of the fines, a certain distance through sterile ground with no fines, then we would stop and move on to a different area. Now, as it happened, as we went forward, we were allowed to extend this trench. And the reason for that is, you see from the second photo here, this is the side of the ship. Now, the type of ship she was is from the point of naval warfare where they didn't have long distance cannon. They would attempt to come alongside, use grapples to pull each other close together. They had what was called a stern and bow castle, and the massive amount of onboard personnel were not sailors or crew of the Gribshunden, they were Marines. So the idea was, once close enough, pull each other alongside, use weaponry such as crossbow, arquabus, and early cannon to inflict as much damage as possible to the operational capability of the ship and the crew, and then board and start a rather brutal, bloody hand-to-hand combat on board each other's ship. Our trench was decided to be dug or excavated just in front of the forward wall of the stern castle. It's called a stern castle because it's literally like a square keep at each end of the wreck. And the idea was that this would be a good area for several reasons. It might enable us to access cargo or storage in the hold. It should be the area where the king and the more well-to-do crew members were able to have their accommodation. And it could also potentially be in the area of the galley. Now, you can see from this photo with the diver for scale, running horizontally directly under the diver from left to right of the photo is a huge timber. It's around about 1/2 to 3/4 of a metre square and runs a significant length of the whole ship. The top piece of this was visible just beneath the sediment when we first arrived. This is not the keel, which gives you an idea of scale, because if this is just one of the side members about halfway up the hull, the keel is effectively behind the diver's fins at the end of the scaffold frame that marked our permitted trench. And then forward, you can see the ribs running up from that center frame. And again, their size, they're about 20-25 centimeters square, dropping down into the side of the wreck. And what she's done, those of you that have been to or know of the Mary Rose, where she basically landed on the seabed on her side, the one half was buried and protected by the sediment in the strong currents and warm marine organism rich waters of the Solent. The other half gradually deteriorated, washed away with currents, degraded away and was gone. So we now have half a ship. What Gribshunden did was effectively her back broke and she laid flat on the seabed. So we have everything, both the port and starboard sides, from bow, where the bow hawser, where the anchor line would have gone through, right down to the rudder, still remain on the seabed in various degrees of buried. And as we said on the previous photo here, with this particular shot, we ended up digging down at least 3 meters in places within our specified trench. Now, this is something that I always like to look at myself, because this was hand drawn the old-fashioned way by the first archaeologists that visited the site. When the club first found it, they approached the local authorities, the museum at Ronneby, and asked for assistance and advice. And they went out with one of the archaeologists, and he did this from a central line and basically drew it the old-fashioned way, as we've all been trained during our NAS training. When you look at the scale of the site, approximately 30 meters long, approximately 15 meters across. If you look to the left of the drawing, you can see item 7 looks a bit like a spanner or a bottle opener. This is one of the 2 hawsers. This one happens to be the starboard hawser. So the round hole, broken now, would have had the anchor rope going through it. And if you go right to the far right of the picture, item 3 is the remains of the rudder. And then you can see ribs in areas like 2 and 5 and 4. And the keel would have run right between the 2. And the first thing we did when we arrived on site is we run a non-stretchable 50-meter tape from the hawser 7 all the way to the end of the rudder 3, right across the middle of the site as our central datum point. And the degree of photogrammetry we achieved of the site was so accurate that 1 centimeter wide white tape clearly shows up on our photogrammetric map, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. The interesting thing is we also have multi-beam imagery of the site, and the multi-beam, if laid over this hand-drawn, is absolutely exact. So the quality to which the scientist did this drawing is absolutely amazing. It really is quite inspiring. I remember my rather terrible sketch of the Grisham in Stony Cove on my NAS training, and when you look at something like this, you're inspired to move forward. Here we've got Professor John Adams from Southampton University. He was one of our 4 archaeologists on the project. We had Johan Ronneby from Sotterton University. We have had Brendan Foley from Lund University and Kron Bakaroff from Connecticut, all different expertise, but I think many people will agree that John, when it came to open ship archaeology, pretty much wrote the book. And here he is working on the site. Now what you can see here is we run a system that we started on the Antikythera shipwreck project called guardianship. So each scientist is given a commercial guardian diver. The commercial guardian divers also do all the heavy work. So myself and my team built this scaffold grid at the very beginning of the project. We rigged and set up the water dredge, which you can see just under my hand on the left of the shot there. And then we would work with a scientist each day. 9 meters deep, so John in his doubles here was able to do 90, 100-minute bottom times working. He, as with many scientists, he'd get quite into what he was doing. So our job was to watch their pressure gauges, make sure they had an adequate reserve when it's time to come up. Any heavy lifting of objects was done after an archaeological dive by the rigging crew. And where possible, we'd handle the water dredge for the archaeologists. They liked to arrive on bottom, take their fins off, hang them on the corner spikes of this grid, put their feet between the 2 rows of bars on the scaffolding, and then hang neutrally buoyant, held in position by their feet from the frame. So they were never kneeling on the wreck, so to speak. The corners of the frame were on huge footprints. We put down sandbags, and then we put on top 50 centimetre square plywood planks, and then we put the scaffold legs on top of that, the idea being to give a very large footprint so that the scaffold frame wasn't pushing down on anything delicate that may lay beneath the sediment. As well as those huge footprints, we also put buoys on each corner of the frame, so it wasn't entirely negative. It was just enough negative to keep it in place, but didn't risk damaging the wreck. And you can see that main timber and those ribs in the foreground there. A quick word about the water dredge. It's not an airlift. What it does is the upper pipe, seen here in the darker grey colour, is a fire hose. On a pontoon next to our boat on the surface is a small water pump. Water is pumped into the pump and down this fire hose. It gets to the end of the fire hose, it hits that U-tube that you can see directly under my hand. That's me in the rebreather there with the buoy in my hand. So directly on my hand is a U-tube. The water goes round that U-tube and then continues on down the light grey tube to an outflow. By doing that, it creates suction up the additional tube running about 45 degrees from that grey tube, the light grey tube. And it's a very controllable, very delicate suction, not like the non-stop force of an airlift, meaning that what really all you're using it for, or all we were using it for, is clearing visibility, not clearing away sediment. And here we have John working with that. He's holding that water dredge. You can just see a very delicate trail of sediment going up that pipe now. You can also see his finger is inside the pipe. If you did that with an airlift, it would probably take your finger into the pipe with it, depending on its size and the power of driving it. You can also see he's using a paintbrush to gently brush away the sediment, revealing artifacts item by item. And as we went on with the project through a month, we slowly started to realize just how many incredible delicate things lay beneath that could easily have been damaged if they were sucked away by an airlift or overly aggressive work. We provided big lights. These big Orca video lights gave the archaeologists plenty of vision to work with. And you can see there John hanging upside down. He's a bit old school with his gear. He's got rubber bands there keeping his wrist seals tight so he didn't get flooded. He spent most of his life hanging upside down in holes. You kind of knew where he was from a plume of bubbles coming up between feet that were stuck in a scaffold frame above. But really quite interesting to work with him. One of the things we were cited to do during the project was remove one portion of timber. You can see it there on the left. It's a fairly small portion, but any of you listening who have not tried to use a greenwood saw to chop off a hunk of wood that size, about 10 centimeters by 5, trust me, it's hard work, and any of you who have done it will know that. I actually elected to swap back from rebreather to open circuit for that job, and that was sawed off right near the end. It's then gone back to the labs at Lund University for dendrochronological analysis, revealing not only its age, but also which forest it came from. It came from a forest that is now a part of France, and it came for about 20 years earlier than the sinking, which was 1495, as the talk title says. So the details we got were quite amazing. There's a broader view there on the right as well, looking from above of the scaffold frame. This is, if you imagine the photo, slightly at an angle, but the lower side is the stern of the wreck. The upper part of the photo is the bow of the wreck, just direction. We're situated just forward of the stern castle here on the starboard edge. So you've got basically the midpoint in the foreground, and then the collapsed timbers where she's broken flat open like a flattened cardboard box, meaning unlike Mary Rose, she is still all there. Once we started working down between those timbers on the inside of the hull, we very rapidly began to find barrels. And what's really nice about these barrels being 1495, they were built in a traditional manner, a barrel base, seen there on the left, barrel staves rising up from it, also on the left. And unlike modern barrels, where the staves are pushed together to make the barrel watertight by metal bands, here the bands were made of wet tree roots that would then dry, shrink, and pull the staves together, or sometimes in bushcraft called withies. You'll also notice around the barrels there's the remnants of gravel or small stones. And the hypothesis here is, if any of you have visited the Victory in Portsmouth Historic Shipyard and seen right down in the base of the ship where the cargo was, the barrels are held in place to stop them rolling around by gravel, which also serves as a ballast. The idea was that this is hypothetically what was being used as ballast in the Gribshunden as well. Now, these barrels could have been containing anything, but the Biological and Natural History Department of Lund University were involved in the project. The Gribshunden project was funded backwards. So first we were funding museum space, then conservation, and finally the excavation itself. So we're able to swab and test for what was inside of these barrels to get some idea. And one of the barrels contained not the exact one on the bottom right there, but the bones you see in the top right and the left photos being analysed by the, I'm going to try and get this right, paleoichthyologist, basically an old fish specialist. And she got super excited when we gave her the bones. She said, these are sturgeon bones. And not only are they sturgeon bones, but the bones you've given me are one sturgeon that was in this barrel. And the interesting thing is the sturgeon is now extinct in the Baltic, and it was being carried in a barrel on a ship in the Baltic. Apparently it was a luxury at the time, so maybe this is a barrel of food for the king on board. So really quite exciting, not just to find barrels, but to have the technology, the scientists, and the university infrastructure to find out what was in them. On the left there, we have this hawser. Remember that from the map at the beginning of the talk. This is the starboard hawser. So the anchor rope would have gone through that eye and then down to the anchor to the seabed when anchored, or the anchor pulled up to that hawser. Both of them are there. It's just the starboard one is much more visible and easy to see. On the right there, you can see the main frame with two archaeologists working in open circuit, each with a guardian. This is a handover period. So what we would do is, as one archaeologist was finishing, next would come down with his guardian. The first one's guardian would take him up. So work was more or less continuous. With 4 archaeologists, we were averaging approximately 6 to 9 hours of work per day on site, and always with university archaeologists, not with just divers doing the work for them. The Nova film crew that did the documentary on our Tulsa American project in 2017 were also on site. They're just in the throes of completing the documentary on Gribshunden now. So we had Evan Kovacs from Woods Hole's Oceanographic Institute and Brett Seymour from the US National Park Service doing the underwater filming, and Nova team on the surface filming finds and documenting everything, which is very useful from a funding point of view as well, to get this stuff into museums. Across the middle of the photo, you can see that 1 centimetre wide tape that I mentioned that runs literally from rudder to bow hawser, stayed on site. And this being a colour shot, you can much more clearly see the blue fire hose feeding water to the U-tube, the orange outflow hose taking the water away from that U-tube, and then the 45-degree Y-piece extended with the grey pipe, giving you the suction by effect of Venturi. The milk bottle tied to it with polypropylene line is to make it comfortably manageable in the hand, so you're not holding up the weight, you're just holding it nice and neutral. and that enables us to work centimetre by centimetre down through the sediment. One of the nicest things we found in that Ferns project was this Aquabus. When it was first found, it was actually, funnily enough, laying next to a crossbow bolt. So first impression, looking at the bottom right photo, was it was a crossbow, or the central piece of a crossbow. When it was lifted to surface on this improvised stretcher made from half a box lid cut in half, photographed on the bottom, photogrammetry modelled on the bottom in situ, photographed again on the surface, photogrammetry modelled again on the surface, and then sent away for conservation. We had the conservationists on the boat. They took each artefact back to our land base at the boatyard in Ronneby each evening, and then on from there to the museums for long-term treatment with PEG and with freeze drying. But when this arrived on the surface, based on the photo at the top right, we had a combat archaeologist, a guy called Ralph Warman, on the project, and immediately identified this as not a crossbow but an arquebus, basically an early rudimentary kind of form of shotgun to inflict nasty maximum damage on the marines of the opposing ship. Bottom left there, we can basically see a small submerged item with some sort of marking on it, and when that was basically gently removed from the sediment, as each layer was moved away, it turned out to be this drinking vessel. It has a lid. The lid would have been hinged, much like a big German beer fest tankard. The hinge was leather, so that has rotted away, but the lid was intact. And this was made from a single piece of wood, so effectively turned, the exception being the handle, obviously, but the drinking portion, single piece of wood, turned, so quite amazing. And with the king's crest on it at the bottom there by the thumb. We found a packet of coins in a leather pouch. The remains of the leather was rudimentary, but it was obvious they were in a pouch. This was in the area of the barrels. And again, in the past, when coins were found, often they're concreted or oxidized, so they look like brown cookies. Here we were able to put the conglomerated lump into the MRI scanner at the university, which is a much higher resolution than a medical one, and look down through the conglomerated lump and see in the red and orange there, not just that it's a coin, but to read the inscription, to see the crest and match it to a coin from a coin collection. Lettering here is Mon Mal Moi Ens, which is coin of the city of Malmo. So quite incredible that we were in the water last September. We're now in June. So really 8 months ago, we came out of the water, and already the dendrochronology with age and location, the identification of coins and where they came from, the city of Malmo, the research happening live is really quite amazing. And then we found this, which was kind of super exciting. The right-hand picture is a little concreted, oxidized black ring with obviously some bronze or brass type metal showing through it in some sort of symbols. When this was put into the scanner, all the symbols were visible, and this was translated as Ulrich the Firemaker. And Ulrich the Firemaker is in the archive documentation as the King of Denmark at 1495, who was the king aboard Gribshundens, metallurgist and craftsman. And what this ring is, it's the size of your thumbnail, and this ring is the maker's mark that his position as chief metallurgist and chief armourer for the royals and the king and the aristocracy, he could put his maker's mark within the chainmail that he made. And there's an example of it, a reconstructed example of it over there on the left. So really quite exciting, not just to find it, find out what it was, but then actually get the entire inscription translated as Ulrich the Firemaker. So again, the live research taking place is quite amazing. And here's why she's called Gribshunden. 2006, when the test trench was dug, they were working between the hawsers at the bow, and there was a huge timber. It was upside down. They started to clean around it, realized there was some carvings on it, so they got permission to lift it because it was exposed. Richard and Ingmar Lundgren, the two locators, finders, and chief divers on the Mars project, were allowed to come in and lift it. You can see it there on its improvised stretcher being lifted to surface and arriving on surface. And this is the Griffin Hound, or Griffin Dog, and that is the name of the ship. Now you can imagine this was the figurehead between those two hawsers on the bow of the ship, and with a superstitious 1495 opposing army, this thing sailing forwards towards them with a dragon's head in its mouth, a human head. Quite a scary and impressive thing to see. And this is where her name comes from. Once she was excavated and removed at 2006, she went over to Copenhagen, to Denmark, funnily enough, where she originally came from Sweden. And she's been in treatment, conservation with PEG and freeze drying until the latter part of last year. And the bottom photo now shows her in place in the dedicated museum that is being built to Gribshunden, where all the artifacts will go. So, as I said, it's been funded backwards. Where is the museum? Where will the artifacts go? And they're looking at a very much alive, interactive, very modern museum. Can we afford the conservation? Do we have conservation facilities and booked slots for anything found? And then finally, divers in the water. So effectively funded backwards. So nothing will be damaged by it being lifted and not cared for. And the last little picture I've got from this point is we decided that every team on a project need a T-shirt. And we had formal T-shirts made by the museum, but any of you have seen the original, the actual good original version of the movie Jaws, you'll remember the movie poster is a huge great white shark ascending vertically with its mouth open, and above it on the surface the girl swimming, night swimming, about to be demised. So on our recon dive last April in the winter, I took this shot of Brendan Foley, project leader, with a GoPro. The Lund animation department turned it into a cartoon, drew over the photo, so to speak, caricatured the G-Dog, or Gribshunden, and mimicked the Jaws poster. So we ended up with some pretty cool team T-shirts, and something a little bit fun to add to the project. So I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for tuning in this lunchtime. Thank you to NAS for inviting me to talk. And I'm very proud to introduce next week's talk, which will be on the Rosewike by Alison James and Angela Middleton. So I hope you can tune in for that one. I certainly will be myself. And a final thank you for Mark and NAS to invite me and you guys to listening through this lunchtime. Thank you very much.